The first sign came like a whisper in a quiet room. Almost unnoticed, but impossible to ignore once it caught my attention. I was sitting at the kitchen table, a steaming cup of tea warming my hands, when I opened my bank statement on my laptop. The numbers blurred at first, not from tears, but from disbelief. Then, I saw it: withdrawals I hadn't authorized, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, and charges for things I had never bought. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. The total amount was staggering. It felt like someone was pulling the rug from beneath me, piece by piece. How could this happen? Where had the money gone? The truth was settling like a cold weight in my chest. Someone I trusted, someone close, was taking from me. And the only person who could explain it was my own son. I remember the moment I decided to confront him. It was late evening, the house quiet except for the ticking clock in the hallway. My son, James, was sitting on the couch, scrolling through his phone. I sat down beside him, the lump of dread twisting in my stomach. "James," I began softly, "can we talk about the bank statement?" I noticed some unusual activity. He looked up, eyes calm but unreadable. "What do you mean, Mom?" I hesitated, searching for the right words. "There are withdrawals, payments, and transfers that I didn't authorize. They add up to a lot of money. Do you know anything about this?" For a moment, there was silence. Then he smiled, a small, practiced smile. "Mom, it's nothing. Just some loans I took to cover some expenses. I'm working on paying you back." I wanted to believe him. His words sounded reassuring. But inside, I felt a growing pit of worry. Why had he kept this from me? Why had I only found out by accident? Days passed, and the missing money was only the beginning. Bills went unpaid, utility notices piled up in the mail. I noticed packages arriving at his apartment, filled with expensive gadgets and clothes that didn't fit his modest salary. When I asked, James brushed it off with excuses. "Mom, I'm trying to figure things out. It's a tough time, but I'll get through it." Yet every excuse felt like a cracked mirror, fractured reflections of a truth I was afraid to face. One afternoon, I found messages on his phone, hidden conversations about debts, gambling, and borrowing from people I didn't know. The man my son once was, the boy I raised, felt distant, almost unrecognizable. I wrestled with my feelings. Anger mixed with heartbreak. Disbelief tangled with shame. How could someone I loved so deeply betray me? How had I missed the signs? I recalled every late-night worry, every silent prayer. Had I been too trusting? Too naive? Trust is a fragile thread, and once it snaps, the unraveling is painful and slow. Night after night, I lay awake, thoughts racing. I thought of my mother, her strength through hardships. I thought of the promises I made to myself when I became a mother: always protect, always believe. And yet, here I was, betrayed by my own child. The walls around me felt like they were closing in. The home that once felt like a refuge now seemed foreign, haunted by secrets. But amidst the despair, a spark ignited, a resolve not to be broken. I told myself that this pain would not define me. I would seek the truth, no matter how painful. I started keeping records, bank statements, emails, texts. I sought advice from friends, from professionals, from those who had walked similar paths. Every day was a battle between love for my son and the betrayal that cut deeper than words. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the living room, James sat beside me. He looked tired, worn. "I'm sorry, Mom," he said quietly. The words hit me like a storm, yet I stayed silent. It was the first time I saw vulnerability beneath the mask. But apologies could not undo the past. I knew then that the journey ahead would be long. It would be filled with difficult conversations, painful truths, and the challenge of rebuilding trust, or learning to live without it. But for now, I held on to one thing: hope. Hope that love could heal. Hope that strength could grow from heartbreak. And hope that I would find peace in the days to come. After that initial shock, life became a delicate dance of suspicion and denial. I tried to cling to the hope that James was telling the truth, that he would fix the mess, pay me back, make everything right. But every day, the truth became harder to ignore. The first step was to look closer, to dig into what was really going on behind the polite smiles and half-truths. I started with the bank statements, scrutinizing each transaction like a detective. There were transfers to unfamiliar accounts, large sums withdrawn in cash with no explanation. There were repeated charges from places I had never heard of, gambling sites, loan companies, even luxury stores that were miles beyond James's supposed income. I remember sitting at my kitchen table late one night, the house silent except for the ticking of the clock and the soft hum of the refrigerator. The cold blue light of my laptop screen was the only thing illuminating the room as I traced the digital trail of my missing money. At first, I thought maybe it was just poor financial decisions, a rough patch James was going through. But as I pieced together messages and documents, a darker picture emerged. Text messages revealed desperate apologies, frantic promises, and mounting debts. He had borrowed money from friends, then strangers. He was gambling, trying to chase losses, spiraling deeper. He was living a secret life fueled by lies. The hardest part was realizing how well he had hidden it. Bills went unpaid. Notices piled up. I found unopened letters from creditors. When I asked James about them, he dismissed them as mistakes or delays. But I could feel the tension beneath his words, the cracks in his story. I remember one afternoon when I found a package at his apartment. Inside were designer shoes, expensive watches, and electronics he'd never mentioned. How had he gotten the money? Where had it come from? I confronted him gently, trying to hold on to the last threads of trust. James, I found these. Where did you get the money for all this? He avoided my gaze, shrugging. Mom, it's complicated. I'm dealing with some things, but I promise it'll be okay. But his promises felt hollow. The weight of betrayal grew heavier. The lies extended beyond money. One day, I accidentally saw a text conversation between James and a man I didn't know, a loan shark demanding repayment, threatening consequences. The language was harsh, desperate. I felt a wave of helplessness crash over me. How had my son gotten so deep into this? How had he fallen so far? The more I uncovered, the harder it was to hold on to the motherly love that had once been unconditional. I wrestled with anger and grief. I questioned every moment, every decision. Had I missed the signs? Had I failed as a mother? The guilt gnawed at me. But amidst the despair, I found moments of clarity. I realized that love alone was not enough. Trust, honesty, and respect were the foundation of any relationship, foundations that had been shattered. I had to protect myself. So, I started documenting everything: bank statements, messages, bills, conversations. I reached out to friends for advice. I spoke to legal counselors who explained my options. Each step was painful but necessary. One evening, James and I sat down to talk. I had prepared myself to hear the truth, no matter how painful. I know what's going on, I said softly, holding his hands in mine. I want to help, but you need to be honest with me. He looked away, tears brimming. Mom, I'm sorry. I didn't mean for this to happen. I just didn't know how to ask for help. His vulnerability broke through my armor. I felt the ache of a mother's heart torn between love and hurt. That night, I lay awake, thinking about the long road ahead. Forgiveness felt distant. Healing seemed impossible. But I knew one thing: I was no longer alone. The moment I stepped into James's small apartment, a sense of heavy inevitability settled over me. The air smelled faintly of old coffee and stale cigarettes, a faint aroma that had come to symbolize the chaos I was beginning to uncover. The cluttered space, once the place my son called home, now felt foreign, tainted by secrets and shadows. James looked up from his phone, startled to see me standing there unannounced. His eyes widened slightly, a flicker of unease crossing his face, but he quickly masked it with a half-hearted smile. Mom? What a surprise, he said, voice light but strained. I swallowed the lump in my throat and sat down beside him on the worn couch. I needed this conversation to happen, no matter how painful. "We need to talk about the money," I began gently, trying to keep my voice calm, "and about the things I've discovered." His face tightened just a little. "I thought we talked about this," he said, avoiding my gaze. "We did, but I need more than promises now," I said. "There are still questions I don't have answers for." James shifted uncomfortably, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of a cushion. "Mom, I'm trying. I'm really trying to fix things." I wanted to believe him. The son I had raised with so much love and hope still lingered in my memories, and the sight of his vulnerability stirred the motherly instinct to protect and forgive. But the evidence was overwhelming, and I had to face it head-on. I started by asking him about the unexplained withdrawals. The large sums of money that vanished from my account, moving to places I'd never heard of. "Where did the money go, James? What were these loans for?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked down, rubbing his hands together nervously. "Some of it was to cover debts, some personal stuff I didn't want to worry you with." "Debts?" I repeated, heart sinking. "What kind of debts? Why didn't you tell me?" His gaze lifted, meeting mine for a fleeting second before dropping again. "I didn't want you to think I was a failure." I was embarrassed. The word embarrassed hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken shame. I reached out, placing a hand on his arm. "James, you can tell me anything. I'm your mother." He nodded slowly, but the walls he had built around his pain remained thick. Our conversation spiraled between moments of honesty and evasion. He admitted to borrowing money from friends and strangers alike. There were debts accumulated from gambling, from bad business decisions, from nights filled with poor choices. I heard about the pressure he felt, the weight of expectations, the fear of disappointing me and others. He spoke of feeling trapped, isolated, and desperate. Yet with each confession came denial, denying certain loans, denying some charges, blaming others for misinformation. I realized then how skilled he had become at weaving half-truths and lies, each thread tangled deeper than the last. At one point, he tried to shift blame. "It's not all my fault, Mom. The economy's bad. My job's unstable. People take advantage of you when you're down." His words were laced with frustration, but also a plea for understanding. I wanted to reach out, to offer comfort, but my own heart was breaking. The man in front of me was drowning, but he was dragging me down with him. I asked about the packages I'd found, the designer clothes, the electronics far beyond his means. He shrugged, attempting to laugh it off. "Mom, everyone needs some comfort, right? I'm not perfect." That laugh felt hollow, and I could see the desperation beneath it. One of the hardest moments came when I discovered messages between James and a loan shark, a man whose threats echoed with cold menace. I confronted James with the messages. His face paled, eyes filled with panic. "I didn't know what else to do," he whispered. "I thought I could handle it." I felt a mix of sorrow and fear. This was beyond financial trouble, it was a dangerous spiral. That night, alone in my room, I sat with my head in my hands. Tears flowed freely as I faced the harsh reality: the son I loved was lost in a maze of his own making. My thoughts raced: was I responsible? Had I missed the signs? Was my love enabling him? The questions tore at me, but I knew I needed to find clarity. In the days that followed, I tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. I went about my daily routines, but my heart was heavy. I called friends, seeking advice. I consulted professionals about financial and legal options. Each conversation chipped away at my denial, building a roadmap forward. Despite the hurt, there were moments of hope. James showed flashes of remorse and willingness to change. He apologized with sincerity that broke through my defenses. "I want to make this right, Mom," he said one evening, voice trembling. I wanted to believe him. But forgiveness was not instantaneous. It was a process, slow, painful, and fraught with setbacks. I realized that healing would take time, and that trust once broken must be rebuilt brick by brick. The mother in me still hoped. The woman in me prepared. I steeled myself for the long journey ahead. The silence after our confrontation was suffocating. It was as though the air around me had thickened, making each breath a laborious task. The words James had spoken lingered like an echo in an empty room, confessions tangled with denials, promises shadowed by past lies. I felt as if I had been dropped into a sea of turmoil with no life raft in sight. Mornings became the hardest. I woke with the weight of the night pressing on my chest, tears already staining my pillow. The quiet house mocked me, its stillness a reminder of all that had been lost. I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm tea, staring blankly at the steam rising from the cup, while my mind spiraled through every memory, every painful truth. How could I reconcile the son I raised, the one who took his first steps at my side, who called me mom with pure love, with the stranger who had betrayed me? The man who had lied, stolen, and deceived without a shred of remorse. The anger was a firestorm raging inside me. It consumed my thoughts and made my hands tremble. I wanted to scream, to shake James until he understood the magnitude of what he had done. How could he not see the destruction he was wreaking on my heart? On our family? I remembered the nights I sat by his bedside when he was sick, whispering lullabies and promising to protect him from the world. How cruel was it that now I felt so unprotected, so alone? But anger was only one facet of my pain. Guilt gnawed at me like a relentless rat. Had I been too trusting? Too naive? Was my love for him a weakness that blinded me to the warning signs? I replayed our interactions endlessly. The forgotten phone calls, the hurried texts, the unexplained absences. Had I ignored them out of love or denial? Could I have done more? Was I responsible for his descent? The questions haunted me. I felt as if I was drowning in a sea of what-ifs, struggling for breath. The nights stretched long and lonely. I would lie awake, staring at the cracked ceiling, listening to the distant sounds of the city while my mind twisted in pain. Sometimes, memories of better times pierced the darkness, laughter shared over dinner, the warmth of his embrace, the pride in his eyes on my birthday. Those moments were bittersweet, like shards of glass embedded in my heart. Despite the storm raging inside me, there were moments of surprising tenderness. I caught glimpses of the boy I once knew in James's eyes, the flicker of remorse, the hesitance to hurt me further, the vulnerability beneath the bravado. One evening, after a particularly hard day, he sat beside me quietly. His voice was barely above a whisper as he said, "Mom, I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt you." The words broke through my defenses. I reached for his hand, feeling the tremble in his fingers. Love and pain intertwined in that moment, binding us in a fragile hope. Friends and family became my lifelines. Their unwavering support reminded me that I was not alone in this battle. I confided in old friends who had weathered storms of their own, finding strength in shared experiences. They held my hand, offered words of wisdom, and sometimes just listened in silence. Through their kindness, I learned that healing was possible. I sought refuge in quiet rituals, morning walks in the park, journaling my thoughts, tending to the small garden outside my window. Each act became a balm for my weary soul, grounding me when the emotional waves threatened to overwhelm. The soft rustle of leaves, the gentle caress of the breeze, the scent of blooming flowers, these simple pleasures reminded me of life's beauty beyond pain. Slowly, I began to rebuild myself. I gave myself permission to grieve fully, to cry without shame, to rage without guilt, to feel without restraint. In therapy sessions, I peeled back layers of hurt, uncovering fears and insecurities buried beneath years of love and loyalty. I learned to set boundaries, to protect my heart without closing it off entirely. Forgiveness was the hardest lesson of all. Not because I excused what James had done, but because I refused to be consumed by bitterness. I realized forgiveness was a gift I gave myself, a release from the chains of anger and resentment. It was a step toward peace. As weeks turned into months, the woman I had been before this ordeal felt distant yet unforgotten. I was changing, becoming stronger, wiser, more resilient. The cracks left by betrayal became the channels through which new light entered my life. I embraced the complexity of my emotions, acknowledging that love and pain could coexist, that heartbreak did not erase hope. I found moments of joy in unexpected places, a shared cup of coffee, a heartfelt conversation, a sunset that painted the sky in hues of gold. Life, I realized, was not about avoiding pain but learning to dance with it. The journey ahead was still uncertain. There would be setbacks, difficult conversations, and days when the wounds felt fresh. But I was no longer a victim. I was a survivor. And my story was far from over. The days after the confrontation with James were some of the hardest I'd ever faced. The house was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the turmoil roiling inside me. I moved through the motions of daily life with a weight on my chest that seemed to grow heavier with every passing hour. I was trapped in a fog of betrayal, confusion, and aching uncertainty about what lay ahead. I realized, painfully, that I could not do this alone. The first step was admitting that I needed help. For so long, I had been the pillar, the one everyone leaned on, the rock that others could rely upon. But now, the foundation beneath me was cracked, and I was starting to crumble. I had to find new sources of strength. I reached out to my closest friend, Margaret, a woman whose steady presence had carried me through past storms. I hesitated before dialing her number, my fingers trembling with vulnerability I rarely allowed myself to show. "Margaret," I said, voice shaky, "I don't know what to do. I'm lost." Her voice was calm, filled with unwavering compassion. "You're not alone. I'm here." That simple reassurance became a lifeline. Encouraged by Margaret's support, I began exploring professional help. I found a counselor specializing in family trauma and addiction, someone who understood the delicate balance between love and pain in fractured relationships. Walking into her office felt like stepping into a sanctuary. The walls were lined with books and soft earth tones, the light muted through sheer curtains. For the first time, I allowed myself to truly speak, to reveal the raw, aching parts of my heart. Session after session, I unraveled the tangled emotions inside me, the searing betrayal, the guilt that whispered I had failed as a mother, the fear for James's future, and the overwhelming loneliness. The counselor guided me gently through the process of setting boundaries. She taught me that love did not mean sacrificing my own well-being, that I could care for James without losing myself, that protecting my heart was an act of strength, not selfishness. I learned the importance of self-care, of tending to my own wounds even as I continued to hold space for my son's struggles. Alongside emotional healing, practical matters demanded urgent attention. James's financial misdeeds had left a trail of chaos I had to clean up. I consulted a trusted attorney, someone with experience in family and financial law. Her office was stark and professional, but her words gave me clarity and purpose. "You have legal rights," she said firmly. "We'll work together to safeguard your assets and hold responsible parties accountable." With her guidance, I began taking steps, freezing accounts, collecting evidence, documenting every transaction and conversation. At the same time, I sought out support groups for parents facing betrayal and addiction within their families. Hearing stories that mirrored my own pain and struggles gave me a sense of belonging and hope. These women, survivors of their own battles, became my tribe. We shared tears and laughter, fears and triumphs. Their courage fueled my own resolve. Even small acts of kindness from friends and strangers brought unexpected healing. Neighbors dropping off homemade meals, acquaintances sending notes of encouragement, friends checking in with warm texts. I realized healing did not have to be solitary. But the greatest source of strength came from within. I rediscovered writing, journaling my deepest fears, hopes, and reflections. Words became a bridge between my shattered past and the hopeful future I longed for. I wrote letters to James the first never sent, poured out prayers in the quiet darkness, and sketched visions of a life rebuilt. One crisp morning, standing on my porch watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of rose and gold, I felt a flicker of peace. I understood that healing was not a destination but a journey, a winding path with both light and shadows. I resolved to walk it, no matter how difficult, with courage and grace. I had come to a crossroads. I could choose despair, or hope. I could remain broken, or rise anew. I chose to rise. For myself. For James. For the life still waiting to be lived. The moment to act came quietly, without fanfare or dramatic revelation. After weeks of wrestling with pain and confusion, of seeking advice and gathering support, I realized that healing and justice required more than hope, they demanded resolve. James's actions had shaken the very foundations of my life. The financial betrayal was not just about money, it was about trust shattered, boundaries crossed, and a mother's heart wounded. I had to reclaim control, not just for myself, but to protect what remained of our family's dignity. The first step was setting boundaries, clear, firm lines that defined what I would no longer tolerate. It was terrifying to imagine distancing myself emotionally from my son, but I knew that love without limits had allowed the betrayal to flourish. I communicated these boundaries to James in the simplest terms: honesty, respect, responsibility. Without them, our relationship could not survive. I began the legal process with a lawyer who specialized in family and financial disputes. The office smelled of polished wood and leather-bound books, an atmosphere of seriousness that mirrored the gravity of my situation. My lawyer, Sarah, was direct but compassionate. She laid out the options clearly: freeze accounts, demand repayment, pursue court action if necessary. Each step was a piece of armor in my fight to protect myself. The process was arduous and emotionally draining. Gathering documents, filing motions, attending meetings, it felt like navigating a maze without a map. I wrestled with the fear of public exposure and the stigma that often accompanies family disputes. Yet, every action I took was a declaration of strength, a refusal to be victimized. At the same time, I continued therapy, using the sessions to bolster my emotional resilience. Sarah and I developed strategies to cope with the stress of legal proceedings and the emotional turmoil of dealing with James. I learned the power of self-care, not as indulgence but as survival. The legal action sent a clear message. James, once evasive and defiant, began to respond. There were phone calls, some apologetic, others defensive. He sought arrangements, promises to repay, but also showed signs of understanding the consequences of his choices. I also began rebuilding trust with others. Friends, family, colleagues who had noticed my withdrawal reached out. I accepted their help, their encouragement. I realized that rebuilding my life meant re-establishing connections beyond my immediate pain. Financially, the road was steep. I faced losses and uncertainty. But I was determined to rebuild prudently, learning from the mistakes that had brought me here. I created budgets, sought advice from financial planners, and took steps to safeguard my future. Spiritually, I found solace in quiet reflection and prayer. I embraced the uncertainty of the future, holding on to faith that healing and redemption were possible. James's role in my life changed. I loved him as my son, but I no longer allowed his actions to define me. I held him accountable with compassion, but without enabling. Taking action was not easy. It demanded courage I did not know I had. It forced me to confront painful truths and walk through fire. But in doing so, I reclaimed my power. I was no longer a passive victim. I was a woman taking charge of her life. After the storm of confrontation and the battle of taking action, a fragile calm began to settle over my life. But healing was not a moment, it was a slow, deliberate process, often uneven and unpredictable. Each day presented new challenges and opportunities for growth. I found myself standing at the threshold of rebuilding, knowing that the past could not be erased but that the future was mine to shape. The first steps toward healing were inward. I spent long hours reflecting on the pain, betrayal, and love tangled within me. Therapy remained a cornerstone, a safe space where I could explore my feelings without judgment, unpack my fears, and relearn trust, starting with myself. One of the hardest lessons was understanding that healing does not mean forgetting. The wounds I carried would never fully disappear, but they could transform. They became the roots of my strength, the foundation for a wiser, more resilient self. I embraced self-care with renewed dedication. Simple rituals, morning walks with the crisp air filling my lungs, tending to a small garden that blossomed with patience, the quiet solace of journaling, became acts of reclaiming my identity. These moments grounded me, reminding me that life, despite its trials, still held beauty. Friends and family played an essential role in this journey. I allowed myself to lean on them, to share my vulnerabilities and accept their unwavering support. Their love was a balm, knitting together the frayed edges of my heart. Professionally, I faced the daunting task of rebuilding financial stability. The scars from James's actions were real, but I refused to be defined by loss. I consulted financial advisors, created budgets, and made prudent investments. Each dollar saved was a victory, a small step toward reclaiming control. I also re-examined my relationships. Trust, once broken, needed to be rebuilt carefully. I learned to set boundaries, to listen to my intuition, and to communicate openly. The journey was humbling but empowering. Spiritually, I found comfort in quiet moments of reflection and prayer. I embraced the unknown with faith, finding peace in surrendering control and trusting in the process of life. James's path toward healing was slower and more complicated. Our relationship shifted, marked by cautious steps, tentative conversations, and moments of mutual understanding. I loved him as my son but held firm in my expectations for honesty and responsibility. I also sought ways to give back. Sharing my story with other women who faced betrayal became a source of purpose. Through support groups and community events, I found connection and healing in helping others find their voices. The process was not linear. There were days of despair, nights of tears, and moments when hope seemed distant. But each day I chose to rise, to face the future with courage and grace. I began to see my story not as one of victimhood but of survival and transformation. The pain, while real, was not the end. It was a chapter, a vital part of a larger narrative I was still writing. Looking ahead, I embraced uncertainty with open arms. I was no longer defined by the past but empowered by the lessons it taught me. I knew challenges would come, but I was ready. I was no longer broken. I was whole. The journey had been long and arduous, filled with heartbreak and hard lessons, but it brought me here, to a place of quiet strength and unwavering self-awareness. I no longer sought validation from others, the only voice that mattered was my own. This final chapter was not about vengeance or bitterness, but about reclaiming my narrative and living authentically. Looking back, I realized how much I had changed. The woman who had once been shattered by betrayal had been reshaped by resilience. Every scar told a story of survival, every tear shed carved space for growth. I embraced the complexity of my emotions, grief mingled with gratitude, pain tempered by hope. Strength was no longer about enduring silently. It was about speaking my truth, setting boundaries, and nurturing my soul. It was in the daily acts of self-love and care that I found my power. I no longer feared the future because I understood that life's unpredictability was part of its beauty. I welcomed uncertainty, knowing I had the inner resources to navigate whatever came my way. Forgiveness became a gift I gave to myself, not to erase the past, but to free myself from its hold. I learned that forgiving others did not mean excusing their actions, but releasing the burden of anger and resentment. I embraced my imperfections and celebrated my strengths. I stopped seeking perfection and began seeking authenticity. I allowed myself to be vulnerable, knowing that true connection comes from honesty, not pretense. My relationships transformed as well. I cultivated connections that honored mutual respect, trust, and support. I let go of those that drained me or eroded my peace. Professionally and personally, I stepped into new roles with confidence. I pursued passions long set aside and dared to dream again. I invested in myself, knowing that my worth was inherent, not contingent on others' approval. I found joy in small moments, the warmth of sunlight on my face, the laughter of friends, the quiet peace of a well-spent day. These moments became the fabric of my renewed life. The pain of betrayal did not define me. It was a chapter, not the whole story. Now, I stand firmly in my truth, owning my story with courage and grace. I am a woman transformed, no longer bound by fear or past wounds, but empowered by the wisdom they brought. I am not just a survivor, I am a thriver. And as I look forward, I do so with an open heart and steady hands, ready to write the next chapters of my life, on my own terms.